All right, we will call committee of the whole to order. So, first thing on our agenda, move to approve the minutes.
So moved.
And
Second.
second. I was like, I don't think I moved with it. Whatever. We have a movement, motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. And that motion passes. So that takes us on to, we have two things really is one thing. The first thing is the communication, which sort of explains the resolution that we're here to talk about tonight, from Mayor George and myself, laying out the reasons for the resolution as well as some shared goals moving forward. And then the resolution itself, Resolution 2024-10, and to allocate remaining ARPA funds not yet encumbered or contracted for expenditure for previously identified projects to the city's sewer and water projects. So with that, before I turn over the administration, do we have any comments from council members before we get going about this? All right, and then I think, was Director Leininger kicking it off, or yeah, okay, Director Leininger.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the committee. So I have a few slides that I'm going to walk everybody through to really supplement the communication, which came from Council President Keppel, Mayor George, with a big lift in there from our law department. So I'm going to rely heavily on that as far as some of the background. I do want to point out a few items that are in there that I think are important to just frame the discussion that we're having here this evening about our ARPA funds and what we've learned over the last 2 years since those ARPA funds, or since the ARPA rules have really transpired and been implemented. And so first is that the regulations governing ARPA, which is the American Rescue Plan Act, that's the $47 million that the city received 2 years ago. They've grown more prescriptive over time. They did that in part through, there were interim rules, if you recall, that came out when the ARPA dollars were released, and then ultimately in April of 2022, the final rule was implemented, and that was very, had a lot of pages to it. It was 437 pages of rules governing these funds. Since that has come out, we've learned a lot more, even just from the interpretation and the administration of those rules from attorneys, from finance directors, from auditors, as they have all dove into these rules in much greater detail over the last 2 years. Another thing that's happened over the course of time is that on May 11th of last year, President Biden ended the public health emergency related to COVID-19. That's significant because of how we can spend our ARPA dollars. Our ARPA dollars, and I'll share this with you on the next slide or next couple of slides. There are really 4 or 5 purposes how you could use those, and one of those is in response to the pandemic. And so as we think about projects moving forward and we're outside of the pandemic, you can no longer do that because the pandemic is technically ended by a matter of law. And so that brings us to what we've all been focused on the last year, 18 months, as we've allocated our projects, and now looking back at our understanding of the rules, is that how we've allocated our projects and our funds, they may no longer fit within the eligible uses of the U.S. Treasury Department. And as a result, they may create some risk to the city that the federal authorities may ultimately come back and may seek the return of funds. Our goal in having this conversation, our goal with this legislation is to eliminate that risk to Lakewood taxpayers. And so with that, let me dive then into the kind of a little bit of a story and background as far as where we've been and where we're at today. So if we go back, and we received over $47 million in ARPA funds in 2000, and actually the end of 2020, early 2021. The ARPA funds can be utilized for really 4 categories that are applicable to us. There's a 5th category for broadband, but broadband is really generally for those areas that do not have broadband, more rural areas. But there's 4 eligible categories of how we can utilize our funds, and that is, of course, response to the pandemic, premium pay for essential workers during the pandemic, water and sewer infrastructure, and then for government services, which is, we also call that revenue replacement. That's just general government, how we operate our government. Items 1, 2, and 3 fall within a much larger category. And so how that affects us is a little over $37 million that we can utilize for items 1, 2, and 3. When it comes to revenue replacement, ultimately the rules that were put into place dictated how cities could determine what that number is. So in the case of Cleveland, who received hundreds of millions of dollars in ARPA funds, they were impacted greatly by the pandemic and the fact that a lot of our residents that went and worked in Cleveland didn't go to Cleveland and work anymore. They stayed home and worked from home. That was a huge cost burden to Cleveland in the form of income tax, where we actually benefited and did very well during the pandemic. In the case of Cleveland, they can claim a lot larger portion of their share of ARPA funds for revenue replacement, whereas we are essentially bound by if you think about a standard deduction in your taxes, we have a standard formula that we can, or a standard number that we can apply for our ARPA funds, and that's $10 million that can go to revenue replacement. So of the $47 million that we received, this is how it breaks out. The orange pie being for revenue replacement at $10 million, everything else are over $37 million for those other three categories. Moving then a step forward to, okay, we received the funds, how did we spend those funds? We took a couple of our early actions when we received the $47 million, or started to receive the $47 million, because we received in a couple of tranches. And we break that out both by eligible use and revenue replacement. So as it came to eligible use, so those first three categories, non-revenue replacement categories, we put $25 million towards Interceptor Sewer, and then almost $2 million towards rental assistance. That was with Lakewood Community Service Center, LCSC, that citywide residential rent assistance program that we ran very successfully and helped over 3,000 residents stay in their homes during the pandemic. And so of the $37 million of eligible use category, we spent all but $10 million just with that early action. On the revenue replacement side, similarly, we took and allocated funds towards hospitalization fund, towards workers' compensation fund, the aging fund. So of our $10 million pie that we had, we allocated out almost over $6 million towards those purposes. And that left us with a total of our $47 million, just under $14 million that we had, and then to allocate all the other projects that the administration had developed and that City Council ultimately developed. The next couple of slides I'm going to show you are all those projects that we've come up over time. On that spreadsheet too, we'll show you how we've taken what we've learned over the last 18 months and applied that to each one of those categories to assign it essentially into either it's an eligible use or it's a revenue replacement. We'll do that first from the administration-sponsored projects, which is everything on the screen that you see here. I'm not going to go through each one of these individually. But as you look through the list, you'll see at the top are those categories that we've determined that are clearly fall within that eligible use category. The rest of those projects are for revenue replacement. This list includes only those projects that we have moved forward. We are spending money on those. We funded these projects. These are things that are moving forward that were as authorized by City Council from the administration standpoint. Similarly, we can do the same thing with the City Council-sponsored projects. And this comes across on 2 slides, so if you don't see something that was a project you supported, it's probably here. It's just on the next slide. So these are all the projects that City Council laid out that have been funded, and we've either spent the money or we're in the process of spending the money. From Beck Center all the way down through Madison Newman parking lot. Notice that all of these are determined to be eligible revenue replacement, not eligible use categories. Continuing on to a second slide that shows then the remainder of the projects that City Council had supported, and we have taken steps to either have spent the money or taking steps to spend the money. When we take all of those projects and we now start to put them back into their categories of those remaining $14 million that we have, a little over $3 million on the revenue replacement and $10 million on the eligible use, this is what that looks like. And so on the eligible use category, we still have about $7 million in unallocated funds. But what we've backed up against in the revenue replacement side, you'll see that we've spent all of our revenue replacement dollars. And those are the most flexible dollars that we have, given that they're for general government services and not tied to those 3 categories. So what that means moving forward then is we still have $7 million that are available, but they're eligible use restricted. They have to fall within those 3 remaining categories that we talked about. And we can eliminate responding to the pandemic because we're no longer in a pandemic. We can eliminate premium pay because we're no longer in a pandemic. And basically leaves us with water and sewer projects. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But certainly the fact that we do not have revenue replacement dollars to spend, and looking at the balance of the remaining projects that we haven't funded yet, we end up with the next 2 slides, which show the administration projects that are no longer funded, are not able to be funded by, at least by ARPA. I also want to be clear as we share this slide. By being funded or not funded, this isn't a critique of the project itself. We've all determined in the administration presenting projects and the city council presenting projects, these projects are all worthy for our community to take on. Our goal was to utilize ARPA funds in putting these projects forward. Unfortunately, based on our analysis of the ARPA funds and the current rules and where we are, we're simply going to have to look for other funding sources to carry these projects out. So from the administration standpoint, you can see there's a number of projects that we now need to go back and try to identify some additional funding sources for. Some of these are projects that we are taking active steps to implement. The downtown development, the Lake Clifton Connector, which is a partnership with the Cuyahoga County on Clifton Boulevard. But at the end of the day, we simply don't have eligible categories and ARPA funds to utilize for those. On the city council side, here are some projects that simply we have not started, and there's not a funding category to which to place them in because they have to fall within the revenue replacement category. From ADA transition plan to Cove Resiliency Hub to smart cities. Again, not that these projects aren't worthy, we just simply have to look for other funding sources to implement these as we move forward into future budget years or get creative with other forms of financing. And that leads us to, this is the final slide that I'll share with you this evening. So the question becomes, okay, so we have $7 million left. What do we do with it? As I shared with you, as I led into those last couple slides, the category that we're really left with is water and sewer projects because of the fact that the pandemic's ended and that we've utilized all of our revenue replacement funds. So of that $7 million, we do have a number of other sewer projects that are out, sewer and water projects that are out there that are in need of funding, or always in need of funding, especially as we work through our partial consent decree with the US EPA. I've listed a couple of those examples on here. The Interceptor Sewer Project. That project is really about a $28 million project. We allocated $25 million towards it very early on as we had some conceptual numbers for it. But the actual bid price for the project with construction administration is $28 million. We then have 2 other projects that we're in the process of carrying forward now, which is the Lewis Sewer Project and the 2024 Waterline Replacement Program that we're continuing each year. So there's a total of up to $12.5 million of water and sewer projects that are out there. They're ready to go. They can get they're either under construction or about to be under construction. So they meet some of the ARPA deadlines as far as being encumbered by the end of this year and then constructed by the end of 2026. And that's where, as we share where we are with the ARPA allocations and what to do and fully spend all $47 million of the funds that we receive. This is how we would suggest and propose that we move forward with the expenditure of those funds, and then take a step back and let's work together and figure out how we fund those projects that we couldn't get to with this $47 million. So with that, I'll look and see if anybody has anything to add on the other side. So, and if not, I can answer any questions, or we can all answer questions for you.
Great, thank you. You know, one of the things I was just thinking about with this is that when I was at National League of Cities almost a year ago, they were very much advocating that cities should get these funds allocated quickly and be very thoughtful about it, because there was a lot of concern that there would be attempts to claw back these funds, particularly depending on how the next election cycle goes. So, you know, it's interesting. And that conference is coming up again in just a few weeks, so it just was just thinking about that. One of the things that I wanted to sort of emphasize here is, you know, as Director Leininger mentioned, is the projects that are listed now as unfunded, that we, as council members will recall, that was part of why we sort of scrambled to get together for that retreat so that we could be talking about that in the context of what we need to go to bond to fund, what we're funding through ARPA, and what we're going to get creative to figure out how we're going to fund in some manner. So those things are still being thought about, and Mayor George and I were thoughtful about listing a lot of those priorities on the communication, but recognizing that not everything can continue to be at the same level of priority because not everything has those, we don't have those same dollars available. So being thoughtful about that. So with that, council members have, do any council members have questions? Yes, Councilman Bullock.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for the presentation and the communication from the administration. I've got a couple series of questions. One is the legal interpretation of the Treasury guidance that we're discussing tonight. Is that consistent with what some of us may have had a one-on-one with the law director a month ago? So there's no update to that, and the interpretation of the city's law department is unchanged in that these categories on the slide here, essentially, we're down to number 3, water and sewer infrastructure. Just confirming that for the record. Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. That's number 1. Number 2, of these, I'm just thinking out loud here, of these listed options, they all seem sound to me in terms of water and sewer infrastructure potential projects to support. I suppose they could, you could take the just above $7 million and apportion it across those, or you could pick 1 or 2 and not all of them. The question I would have to prioritize is which contributes to the federal clean water obligations under our, the term is escaping me, the EPA required, I was going for the other thing, the consent decree, which requires us to implement the plan called IWIP. Thank you. I would think interceptor sewer, potentially Lewis sewer, if there's some infiltration where the houses connect, but I don't know. So to me, interceptor sewer would be something to prioritize. The second point would be, could we view the $7 million as a way to deliver some cost savings to ratepayers? Because we're going to do these projects listed on the slide, and the typical plan would be that we'd bond it out, and then we'd for the portion of the bonds that belong to, that get paid for by sewer and water rates, that has resulted in a series of increases over the years. If we can relieve $7 million additional, then arguably that relieves a certain burden on the future billing rates, but only if we agreed as a city that we would keep the pace and not add another $7 million on top. So that's a policy directive, but that kind of came from an informal conversation with the council president and with Councilman Baker. I thought it was a good idea to try to essentially put in a locked box, to quote a favorite presidential candidate, the $7 million and deliver that back to residents. That's an option. Would welcome thoughts there. Thanks.
I can answer those, Councilman. So in terms of the first question, surprisingly enough, the interceptor is not technically part of the EPA consent decree. If you recall, that kind of popped up during a routine inspection about how bad the interceptor was, and so we needed to take immediate action to reline the interceptor. But those $7 million, if you will, they will go towards the remaining portion of the sewer project or interceptor and then split between Lewis and the 2024 water mains, depending on what additional grant or loan dollars we're able to receive. In terms of future water rates, yes, this will certainly positively impact the future water sewer rates. We can do some evaluations during our monthly water sewer meetings, but most likely we'll see the impact when we look at the next 5-year increment of water sewer rates. But yes, certainly, I think that's a great positive for everyone in this community, whether it be resident or business owner. You are going to see that reduction from applying all these funds to water sewer.
Any further questions from council members? Councilman Baker.
And thank you to the Planning Department, Finance Department, and Law for getting all this together. One thing I am curious about is I assume that our bond offering will go down $7 million based on this. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's the plan.
Okay, and then so then thinking about that going forward, right? So like any city capital plan, there's a limit to the amount of dollars you can spend on capital, and there's also a limit to how much staff can manage construction and design and implementation. But just on a dollars and cents going forward scale, how much, so putting $7 million into it today, how much does that save us every year over what those notes would be over the next 20 or 30 years? That may be a difficult equation to do now, but I'm just wondering, like in general sense, like what a bond payment monthly or yearly would be on a $7 million note.
We'd have to crunch some numbers for you on that, Councilman Baker.
Okay. I'd appreciate some, because I do think that part of this is residents will reach out asking, and I think that there is no more worthy, I mean, there are lots of worthy projects. Director Leininger went through them. Water and sewer is kind of our core, core municipal services, along with police and fire and building, housing, all that kind of stuff. So I think there could not be a worthier kind of place to put this money, especially because it's an allowable use. But I do think we should think about how to talk about it. And how to talk about it is, if you are putting $7 million down today, it gives you an extra $350,000 a year over the next 30 years, or whatever that number is, because you're not paying interest on it, to then reinvest in the community. So that's why I think having that number and thinking about it strategically kind of like conceptualizes it for the public, because, bond and note financing and, revenue generation, short-term notes versus bonds, those are things that are tough to understand. But I think saying that it saves the city X amount of money for the next 15 or 20 years going forward would be a really helpful way to understand that. So I'd appreciate if, just from a high level, the Finance Department could provide council with about what that is per year we would save based on deferring $7 million in bond offerings.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Councilman Baker. And to that point, so Director Rancourt, if you can potentially get that to us in the future, is because I do think that that is a valuable thing. As we were talking about this in our conversations, that also we're always cognizant of the debt load of the city and how much we're saving today by doing this, to not accrue that debt for the future, as well as essentially those interest. And then additionally, I guess I had a question, Director Rancourt, or whoever feels that they can answer it. So some of the bonds that we were looking at before, because that was kind of some of the pace at which we were having this conversation in terms of which things we needed to think about how we were paying for them a little differently, because if we're putting this money in, then we're not having to take the bonds out to pay for it. But do we have some flexibility? I believe one of those had some sort of general language about other improvements. So are there, is there room as we look at these list of, I don't know, Dr. Langer, if you can go back to the list of unfunded, maybe. For instance, I'm thinking of like some of the ADA transition plan, or even in the administration, I know there's municipal building projects, the women's locker room, these sorts of things. Like, would those be eligible with the bond that was written with those additional projects?
Madam President, those dollars are already kind of allocated to the specific projects that we outlined in the original legislation. I know they might have indicated like under other category in the bond offering, but that was to fit in things like Lakewood parking lot, things
Sure.
of that nature.
Sure, but we, with granting authority up to a certain amount, and now we're moving this money, we're putting the 7 million for the water sewer. So I was just wondering if there was flexibility there in terms of which items could be included should the opportunity arise, or is that language very finite?
It's very finite. Really, these are discussions I think we have to have as we work our way through to the budget for 2025.
Right, great, thank you. And then along the, okay. Along that point, I also, or slightly different point, I just wanted to clarify, and this might be more of a law question. The language of the resolution says any, so encumbered or any funds not encumbered or contracted. And when we go to that funded list, some of them are encumbered but not contracted. And I had a question from a constituent who was interested in one of these projects. And so I just wanted to get clarification because they asked me, and that there would not be, because even though they're not contracted yet and they're encumbered internally, there wouldn't be an opportunity to say like, oh, we'll just kind of drag our feet on this and then it didn't happen and now we're moving that money all into water and sewer, if that makes sense, because if it's not contracted today. But because it says it's encumbered, that means we are committed to doing it. Is that an accurate reading?
So there's a couple examples, and I can jump in, and
Thank you.
Peter, you can correct me. A couple examples of that. So the Madison Newman parking lot, we spent a lot of time talking about that. So in this case, it shows a no under contract and awarded. So your question is could we drag it, just whatever reason, we just don't move it ahead? In presenting this, in presenting this list, this is the project that we're moving forward with. Even though that project is not, it shows a no, we are expending funds to get the design done and expending staff time and staff capacity to move these projects forward. In presenting this, this is our intention of this is what we're going to carry forward. Unless, I mean, there's always crazy things that could happen, but the intention is we're going to get these projects to a point where they are, the contracts are awarded, the money is encumbered by December 31st of this year, and then the project will absolutely be done by December 31 of 2026. So.
Thank you. There's been a lot of public interest in some of these and which things are funded and which are not, so I just want to make sure we're being very clear. And once assuming that we were to pass this tonight, I would really love to we have a list on the council page where we show what we've funded so far, and we probably need to update that given some of this, and we could post essentially some version of this list just so people know what we're spending the money on or will. All right, any further questions? Vice President Schumer.
Thank you. And we're talking about $7 million and things like that. I just have a clarifying question. Is that did we only go out for a note for the $4.8 million sewer improvement, and we haven't? I'm just curious that have we not this other monies that we're dedicating? We haven't gone or approved anything in terms of notes or bonds for that yet, right? Just for the $4,810,000.
Just the bond transaction has gone through. The note transaction is kind of delayed until after hopeful passage tonight, at which point, we'll get the note offering kind of finalized tomorrow and work with bond counsel on that.
Right, but that only impacts ordinance 44, 2023, right? That's the one that allows the issuance of notes in the amount not to exceed $4,810,000 in the anticipation of issuance of bonds to pay costs of designing, engineering, constructing sewer improvements. Would that be the only one that is note that's impacted? So basically just, you won't use that authority to,
It will reduce the authority in the, like it's an $12 million offering, we'll reduce it by the 4.78 million
Right.
that we have that's attributable to the Lewis project.
okay, it's that project. Okay. Yeah, I don't have any questions.
Any other questions, comments, concern? Okay, yep, Councilman Bullock, yep.
Okay, just to clarify what Councilman Shackner asked, and then a follow-on to a comment earlier about which of these projects. So are these three projects, the Interceptor Sewer, Lewis Sewer, and 2024 Water, all intended to be done, or at least initiated this year, both financially and in terms of construction? Is that the plan? Okay. And then I thought I heard a comment, though, that some of these may be partly dependent on other matching grants, for example, or state grants. Did I mishear that?
Yeah.
I mentioned it as we're always looking for grant and loan dollars with any project, but in front of me right now, I don't have numbers of if we have grant dollars associated with this. I'm just, as a general statement, we're always looking for grant or loan dollars for these projects.
Okay, so that certainly makes sense. So, but as far as, my real question is just, are these solid projects that we're proceeding with for certain?
Yes.
And the answer is yes, okay. And then finally, but I think Director Rankator's question, or answer to Councilman Shackner's question, confused me a little. So the note offering will be reduced by, the plan is to, by the amount of the Lewis sewer, which is 4.7, great, but that's not the same as 7 million. And we discussed with Councilman Baker that there was going to be a reduction of by the total 7. So where would the difference be made up?
Pursuant to the legislation in a different water sewer project is what seems like that's what the legislation's saying.
Okay, so the water, I don't have it in front of me, the list, so that's why I'm asking for clarifications. But will the city's debt save $7 million? Debt issuance for the new notes this year save $7 million? That's what I'm really trying to confirm.
We'll save $7 million. At some point, it may be over more than 1 year. So as it is now, we just have to have the money obligated by the end of 2024. So we know we'll save the 4.7 million paying interest on it this year, and then that other 2.3 million presumably will be
Can
a
be
different
held in
project.
reserve until perhaps next year.
Sure. Yes.
Okay. All right, thank you. That answers my question.
Great, okay. All right, well, then I will move to refer Resolution 2024-10 favorably to full council. Motion's been made and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Aye. And that motion passes. No further business. We are adjourned.